Hi, my name is Fred Cohen, and I do a lot of stuff. I've been a trusted advisor since the 1970s, and I was going to give you a discussion today of standard of practice on how that process works for cybersecurity. If you go to the all.net website, I want to start with some history. So long ago, started working on information protection. In fact, introductory information protection was written in the 1980s. When I was visiting Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute. It was a paper to try to identify the curriculum elements and the other information that you would want to teach cybersecurity. From there, I went on to get my PhD with the topic of computer viruses. Somewhere along the way, I ended up writing a book in the early 90s called Protection and Security on the Information Superhighway. And this was published at that time. The information superhighway was a term being used at that time. But the whole purpose of this was to talk about how you do assessments of cybersecurity. At that time, it was called information protection. And I had created in the mid-'80s, late '80s, what's called protection posture assessments. And we did these assessments for, DoD elements and for private industry. And so since the 1980s, I've been doing this for companies. And it became a methodology, and the methodology was then applied by lots of others. It's all been published. And so as they applied the methodology, they came up over time with an overarching picture of what you do for protection. And so I developed, and again, you can go get this all at the all.net website, an overview. When I worked at Burton Group in the early 2000s as the principal analyst for security and risk management strategies, I learned about building diagrams for things. And so I built this diagram to explain how cybersecurity works, what's the architecture of overarching architecture and model. And so one of the things when I present this to people is they say, well, this is so complicated. Can't you do it like in 3 bullets? And the answer is no. I explained to them that, I'm building a house right now. I have the description of one room in my house has more details and more complications than this picture of cybersecurity for a large enterprise has. So you just have to recognize that things are not trivial in the world. We start out with how the business works, go through oversight and duties to protect, use the duty to protect in affiliation with the risk management function to figure out what to protect and how well. You go through security management, which is a feedback system where the person in charge controls what goes on. And then we have various management processes, and then they operate to achieve protection objectives. In fact, this is a clickable diagram, so you can click on the diagram anywhere. And the protection objectives are part of the control architecture, which is, we'll call it a meta level in turning what management wants to do and what people assert they're going to do into technical mechanisms. The technical security architecture deals with things like the protection process, prevent, deter, prevent, and so forth, the data state, life cycles, content, and then there's actual protective mechanisms that interact with the content and its business utility, basically to assure that the way this business works, it continues to work. So the object of information protection or cybersecurity from a standpoint of a business is to make sure the business continues to work up to its potential. So over time, we started to recognize that the nature of this is that there are decisions to be made by executives. And so we developed a set of standards of practice. And I'm just going to open up the one example of standards of practice. The basic concept is there are a lot of decisions you make. And they go everywhere from top management decisions about how do you describe yourself, how do you make sure you're doing the thing you're supposed to do, what promises do you make, how do you make sure you fulfill them, and so forth, into how you model the business, what your oversight function is, risk management, the same things you saw in the picture, only in more detail. And if we drill down a little bit further, for example, we can look at the risk management process, and we'll see that the standard of practice is built up from a set of options, a decision you have to make, and the basis for making that decision. So one of the things I identified some years ago is that in any decision, when you have a question like, gee, what risk assessment process am I going to use? There's a set of options. There's a finite number of options. In this case, there are 7 that we've identified that are the common options. And then you have to decide between the options, and different circumstances call for different options. For example, high threat, high consequence, you might want to use this systems analysis approach. But if it's low threat, low consequence, some sort of a lightweight initial assessment is fine, or just do minimal due diligence and so forth. So when you start to understand this and start to make those decisions, and then have a basis for the decision, why you make them, right? Why would I choose this one over that one? What's the features of it? What makes it better or worse in a given circumstance? Once you do that, you start to recognize that these drivers, like threats and consequences and so forth, there's a limited number of drivers that allow you to make many decisions with a relatively small number of inputs. Compare this to trying to make similar decisions when you have all the bits from all the settings on all the computers and all the networks that you're attached to as a basis for making decisions. So what happens here is there's an efficiency that you gain by using an approach that allows you to understand the decisions you have to make, the options, the basis for deciding between them, and then drives you through that process. Now, in a generic sense, this is all fine and good, but there's a problem here. And the problem is that if you're going to do this on a day-to-day basis, you need tools. So we built tools, and we've had these tools running for quite some time. And you can see all the same elements that you see in the standard of practice, and all the same elements that you saw in the diagram are codified here into tools. And these tools allow us to gather information on the situation. So in effect, for example, the overarching protection model, we can figure out what, whether you're using this model or that, which things are part of it and so forth. And we can check those things off very quickly in boxes and get you to answers to questions. What are your promises? Who are you promising to? And they form very straightforward sorts of sentence structures. And those sentence structures then allow you to come with output that's usable. So I'm just going to go attached to, let's see, we were on risk management processes, for example. What process to use? Well, we use minimal due diligence, and scenario-based we use for select high-valued systems. And you got to, of course, correct your spelling. Thank goodness for automatic spell checking and correction. So you save this, and this is now how you've codified your decision. So what we do is we use this methodology to allow us to very efficiently go through this process with companies. And we've been doing this, like I say, since the 1980s. We're now, in 2018 or so, and we've just gotten very efficient at using this to drive through the as-is situation in the standard of practice. So one of the things that we found, and I just want to take you back to all.net. One of the things that we found is the standard of practice is freely available online, right? So you just click on protection, and you go click, for example, in the archives and records management standard of practice down here, and you pick on any of these items. How do you model itself in your business? And you can go through it. You can work your way through it. In this case, you model yourself however you want to model yourself. It's up to you, right? In other cases, you have a finite, how do you do risk management? What process do you use? We'll just open this one up, see where we go there. So, here are your options. You can go through it, and you can figure out which options, you want to use, and the basis for making the decision. You can make a decision for your enterprise. The problem that we saw was that when you're faced with 110 or so of these decisions, each one of them has lots of details underlying it, why you do it, how you do it, and so forth. It takes, we had one company that started the process, and a month later they said they got about 1/10 of the way through it, spent a few, 100 hours of internal time, and then they called us and said, can you just do this for us? And so we use our tools, live, online, remote, to capture the initial data from the current situation. It takes about a day, and then over the next 10 to 20 days, we do evaluations and come up with a reasonable and prudent future state to find a path forward for the enterprise, as opposed to the assessment methodology you see from the great big firms, which are $500,000, take 6 months, and some of it's very good and very useful and in more detail. But on the other hand, That's a lot of money and a lot of time. And instead, when you go through a process like this, it's faster. So you can sort of see these tools that we have that support the process. So the problem is that's expensive. It's expensive for us to do that for you. So what we decided to do was to create a set of boot camps. And with the boot camps, what we do is we bring you on board. We give you access to the tools. And it takes about 8 sessions. And you go through this for your business. We answer questions during joint sessions and meetings and so forth. And that provides you a path to at least get your current situation well codified into a report, relatively short order with relatively minimal time and effort. So the last thing I have to tell you, because my sales and marketing folks say I have to, is that if you're interested in participating in a boot camp, you can click on some link somewhere. Probably it's somewhere below. So we'll be talking more about the details of the standard of practice in some future videos, and I hope you'll come and watch them. Thank you.